Hey, Alex.
Yes, Sarah?
What's the hardest thing about being a third generation atheist?
It makes it really hard to rebel.
What about dating ex Christians? Welcome to Mistakes Were Made, a podcast about non monogamy for messy people like us. I'm Sarah. I'm a queer, non monogamous therapist, parent, and writer.
And I'm her husband and co-host, Alex.
And I am Jessica, here producing.
And today we're here with Tyson, a passionately ex-Christian with a heart of gold and a lot of hot takes on the evangelical to poly pipeline to keep us warm this holiday season. Hi, Tyson. Welcome back to the show.
Hello.
Thanks so much for being here today.
This is Tyson's third time on the show, we're realizing. You're our most prolific guest, I think.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? And you've been at our old studio, which was our old kitchen.
I remember that.
And now you're in our new studio, our new kitchen.
Love it.
And as indicated, we're talking Christians and polyamory today. So a topic that I know you have a lot to say on.
Yeah.
And I guess more specifically, the prevalence of folks who have left high control religions and entered the lifestyle. So, polyamory, non-monogamy, swinging, and maybe just like starting there. Is that a thing? I mean, am I making this up? It seems like a thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I feel like every other polyamorous person I meet has some sort of religious past that they have overcome and left. So definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not just about me being friends with you. And I'm like, well, this is Tyson's story. So...
Yeah, no. I am continually, realizing that like the story that I had that I sometimes feel is unique is like, oh no, actually there's a lot of people who've experienced this very same thing. And some people come from like really like toxic backgrounds and it's something that's very common.
Yeah.
So.
And as you were alluding to up top, I've definitely encountered it a lot in like, people that I've dated in non-monogamy. And sometimes like very surprisingly, like I'll meet a person and like they will, I never would have guessed. And then they'll like reveal to me that they're like, oh yeah. And I grew up in, this like had this extreme evangelical background or like things like that. And it's, often surprising, but it does seem to be a common thread.
It is. And we've talked about this kind of casually over the years because it's something that has shown up in my practice a lot. And, I work not specifically but with a lot of polyamorous queer people in the greater Seattle area. And this is an estimate, but I would say easily 60 to 70% of those folks who show up in my office have some kind of high control religious background
and that's not something that you're like obviously specifically catering to, right?
No, in fact, it's something that I feel like I've been on kind of a steep learning curve with in recognizing that I need to build professional competence and kind of like cultural sensitivity around it because it seems
you need
so
to get
prevalent.
some Jesus in you, girl.
Well, that's like maybe a good segue into just introducing ourselves and our positionality around this. What is everyone's relationship to Jesus?
Who here has accepted Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior? Tyson, will you start?
Sure. So I think Jesus was probably a decent dude. I don't know. I don't trust anything that anyone said about him, but I don't know. Whatever. So I grew up Reformed Baptist Christian, and what that looks like is some pretty toxic theology around who like God choosing people for salvation and not.
The Reformed part isn't less like conservative; it's more.
It's more conservative.
Yeah, okay,
it's far more
They've
conservative.
reformed on the
Okay. Basically, it's like trying to return back to Martin Luther and John Calvin, some of those original theologians, and like that the church today has become more too progressive, right? And basically trying to bring Christianity back to like a more strict, I say toxic theology. And my dad really pushed that on me when I was younger, and we went to like start going to this church out in the middle of the Great Plains in Nebraska. It was an old school building, and there was like a very small group of people that would practice this version of this religion. And yeah, I really fervently believed it. It was like something that I was very passionate about. I was like a apologist is what we would say, is like someone who defends the faith. And I would argue atheists, in my early adulthood, and would like really passionately believed all of it. And it wasn't until like I was 26 that I like started the slow process of questioning, and it took a couple years, but then by 2020 I considered myself an atheist. So
and you do continue.
Yeah, I consider myself an agnostic atheist.
Yeah.
I'm curious, and I think we'll probably unpack this more over the course of the episode. First of all, that's such an evocative picture of this tiny church on the Great Plains in Nebraska, you and your dad. I'm just like, wow, it's so like stark and compelling, and like, I don't know, very of this culture too. There's like an American Gothic kind of feel to it that's super
for sure.
intense.
Yeah.
I'm curious what that church had to say about sex and sexuality and queerness, because that's obviously going to be a big part of the intersection that we're exploring today.
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up with queerness being like it was a mental illness, like a sin, something that was like contrary to God's law and the way that God set up the world. They would refer to Genesis and basically say that like God created man and woman, and that was his intention, right? And that like anything deviation from that is against his image. And when it came to sex, like they were very, very strict, like no sex until marriage. My dad specifically had a viewpoint that like women should always be at home and always be homemakers, and should never be actually like ever have authority over a man in any situation. I was actually at McDonald's once, and there was this young man cleaning the floor, and his boss was some lady, and my dad made a comment of like, yeah, that should never be allowed. Should never be allowed for a man to be under a woman. And so yeah, I think that when it came to like gender roles, it was very strictly like patriarchal, and when it came to sexuality, it was like, yeah, I was a very sexual kid. I had a lot of desires, but those are very much repressed because I was taught that like, you are not supposed to be thinking about these things at all until you get married. And when you get married, then you can like, have those experiences with your wife and your wife alone. And so, yeah. And then I think growing up, when I got older in my 20s and like mid 20s, it just became even worse because I started going to a more conservative church than what I was going to before. And that church was very much like, a woman should be like the helper and should be giving them their body over to their husband whenever the husband wants. And so there's just really toxic stuff for the person I was, partnered with at the time. And then also just so much shame around sexuality and so much repression. And it caused a lot of like turmoil for me in adulthood.
Yeah. And when you think about just from such an early age, having this like really strict worldview imposed on you, and not just like the way the world should look on the outside, but the way that you should exist on the inside, that was also really strictly controlled. Yeah. It's pretty intense and claustrophobic.
Definitely.
I'm curious how old you were when you got married.
I was 20. Yeah. My wife was 19.
Right. And you can see how in a culture like this, the pressure to marry young is almost inescapable.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And you guys met each other in that church?
No, we met each other at work. But then I converted to Christianity, and then because that's what I had to do. I'm like, I like this person, so I have to convert them in order to date them, right? Because I can't date someone who's not a Christian. And of course, she liked me too, and so she kind of converted and went with it, right? And she found her own sense of purpose in it. But yeah.
That's like, can I just say that's really intense? Like, obviously we know each other pretty well, but like, I think I hadn't really heard you say all of that like at once. It's a lot.
Yeah. And I didn't even go into all the detail of the ways that like the church actually repressed sexuality and all of the lengths I went to in my early 20s to repress my sexuality, because I really went to some pretty severe lengths that most people would never go to try and repress it. So.
Just like checking in with you as I'm realizing that this is going to be like a sensitive subject for all of us and maybe especially for you. What does it feel like to talk about it now? What is your relationship to some of those memories and experiences now?
Now I've pretty much healed from these things, and now it's something I like to talk about. I like to share because I want people to kind of understand. I don't think a lot of people understand what it's like being a Christian, and kind of especially when you're someone who really. There are a lot of people who like were raised in it, but never really wanted to be in it, right? But I was someone who like I loved Jesus. I really wanted to be a good Christian, and it was a really big part of who I was, and so my experience is literally like kind of at war with myself because I didn't like these pieces of myself that were supposedly contrary to God. So it's a good, I like talking about it and I like sharing my story because I think it helps other people too. So
Yeah. And because so many people have had
Yeah.
such similar experiences.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about like what sort of percentage of the like population of the country, for instance, is like, from this background or in this kind of church. I mean, it makes you think about like how it plays out in politics, which is obviously like a tangent, but
What
no wonder
percentage of the
women
country is
can't
evangelical
become
or would
president.
identify as
Yeah,
evangelical
or like
Christian?
or a sign of sort of like this sort of new reform evangelical. It's like a lot of. It sounds like you're talking about a sort of extreme case, but it's also like a lot of people who are,
Yeah, I
being
think
raised in these backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who are evangelical. I would say the percentage of people that are reformed are probably pretty narrow, pretty small group of people because it's a pretty niche, pretty fundamental part of Christianity. So I don't think there's a lot of people that are reformed.
Yeah.
But evangelical, yes, there's a lot of people that are evangelical.
Obviously, is huge cultural and political influence in this country. And especially over the course of our lives, insofar as we're part of the same generation, because of the evangelical movement of the 80s, essentially. And like growing up, we were like right in the pocket for growing up with this becoming like a huge influential force in this country.
Yeah.
Okay, so Tyson, thank you for offering your introduction around religion and talking a little bit about how it influenced you and your relationships. Alex,
Yeah.
you're up next because you're going to kind of offer a real counterpoint in some ways.
Yeah, probably the exact opposite as Tyson. Well, maybe not the exact opposite, but I was raised pretty much atheist. Maybe not explicitly atheist, but definitely just like religion was not present except for like in a sort of like occasional like fetishized way, like around Christmas. Sometimes my dad would be like, "What's it say in the Bible?" or whatever. I think the first time I went to church like a couple of times on holidays, but my parents were, second generation. Their parents were either like explicitly atheists or not religious. I was just looking up those numbers, and it's hard to say about like because what qualifies as reform, but like in the 20 to 30% of people in the country are evangelical, and 4% of people in the country are atheists. So it's interesting to think that like, that's a very small portion of the population too who will cop to that. And yeah, I think for me, it's kind of weird to think about this and like to hear your story, Tyson, because being a young person, the guidance that you get or don't get is so powerful and influential, and like having a lot of it, it just feels very like sort of alien to me. It was kind of like nobody was telling me what to do or how to be, other than like the culture, and the culture was like, I was just like, there was no like sort of guidance on like what was okay, like media to consume. I was just like watching TV all the time, watching Miami Vice when I was like 8 after school and stuff like that. So there was like a lot of like exposure to sex, a lot of exposure to like violence, and just like not a lot of like sense of like community. And then I guess the flip side of this, we were talking about this a little bit this morning, not like a lot of like mentorship or like,
Moral
grounded
guidance.
moral guidance. It was just kind of like my parents were like a little bit checked out and kind of like doing their thing, and maybe they didn't really have a strong sense of like how things should be at all. And then around the time you're describing starting to question that, I kind of started questioning my background too. And rather than being like, vehement atheist that was just like, felt like it was really important to my identity in some ways, it was kind of the opposite. And I was kind of like, what else is there? And like, what have I missed out on because of hearing that? And one other thing I just wanted to say is like, I don't think, we were talking about this a little bit on the last episode, I don't feel like that's all spared me from sexual shame at all. And so I really like admire the journey of people who have like started from really being told like, this is wrong, and your like feelings and desires are wrong, because I still grapple with that now, and nobody ever really told me that even explicitly. Or maybe they did, and maybe it's kind of interesting to think about like the subtle ways that happens, but certainly not directly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The culture continues to be really high control around sex and sexuality, with or without the direct influence of evangelical Christianity. I mean, it's worth saying Christianity and evangelical Christianity don't have the monopoly on sexual shame as part of their religious doctrine.
Yeah.
Many, if not all religions have some foundational sort of toxic messaging around that.
Mm-hmm. And that existed in my family around like adultery that was happening and things like that like people weren't talking about, but there was like tension. And I think it existed in the culture, like in the AIDS crisis, there was just like a lot of the like sex education that we got between like that and like, people starting to kind of like rape culture becoming a thing that people like barely sort of understood as a thing. There was like a lot of like, sex is scary and maybe bad, and very bad things can happen to you if you engage in it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's worth noting that, like, I personally see so much Christian influence, even in places that are like supposedly secular. Like, humans have, especially like, we've been Christians for a very long, long time. Christianity is, I think, the second largest religion in the world. I can't remember. Anyway, it's
Is it really? I would have thought Buddhism and Islam would have us in the numbers.
Christianity and Islam are the two. Okay. I don't know which one is bigger.
It depends on how you count China.
Yeah. But like, it shapes everything. Like, it shaped marriage. It shaped the patriarchy. It shaped like our government. It shaped punishment, and it shaped how we do almost everything. And I don't think people always realize, like, how much it actually impacts all of us. So I think all of us have suffered from, it makes sense, all of us suffer from some sort of like Christian shame, because it is a part of our culture.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And I feel like, Jess, it makes me want to ask you about your relationship to some of this material and religion, shame, control.
Yeah. It's super interesting. I mean, I grew up Jewish, right? So theoretically, none of these things impacted me. But I think to your point, like, the culture is so, I sometimes have identified as culturally Christian because of that. It's really
hegemonic.
Yes, there you go. Hegemonic presence. And there, I was raised very like culturally Jewish, but there wasn't a ton of like, it wasn't very much about God, or morals or anything like that. It was more about traditions and family and food and things. Maybe that's what I connected to. But it's interesting too. I think the other thing that I've been thinking about in this conversation so far is, so my husband grew up evangelical and is a first generation atheist now, I would say. All I understand really about the flavor of my in-laws' religion is it's like Midwest mega church. One of my brothers-in-law is like a youth pastor with a lot of tattoos or whatebe.
Okay. Progressive church. Okay.
All right.
Those are the heathens in my church.
But I don't think queerness is not
chill.
No.
Yeah, that's
What about you, Sarah?
I feel like I'm the Venn diagram sort of interface of a lot of these things, because both of my parents grew up in really high control religions, not evangelical. So my mother grew up in a Mormon family.
Oh, okay.
And my father grew up in a conservative Lutheran church and went to parochial school. So I don't have a lot of experience with the evangelical culture at all, but I do have experience with how just controlling insular religious environments can impact people by the way that I saw it impact my parents. And they were definitely and continue to be really deeply influenced by those earlier developmental experiences, you know, and like not to tell their stories for them, but just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. In their like late teen years, both of them came to kind of question something about the faith. Like I think in my mom's case with the Mormon church, it was that they weren't allowed to drink caffeine. And then she found out that the Mormon church was invested in like Coca-Cola or something. And when she went to leadership to talk about it, they essentially were like, yeah, we're making money off of all of these people's sins. That's the idea. And that she just like couldn't, that was a thing she couldn't square. And she ended up leaving the church. It's worth saying that for years and years and years, we would still have people from the Mormon church come to LDS, come to our door and try and get me to go to youth group. So there was a sense of just like really trying to get people back into the church.
Nobody ever tried to get me.
Aw.
My grandfather, so...
Except for the swingers, actually.
This is a bit of a deep track on my family, but in that Mormon family, my grandmother was very Mormon. My grandfather was a Catholic, an ex-Catholic who had a drinking problem and committed adultery, if you will. And I think that for my mom, just like the experience of having like both of those things in the mix was really confusing because it's like the high control experience wasn't positive, and then the sort of rebellion against it was also a negative influence on her life. But a funny thing about my grandfather is he always said that he wasn't going to choose a religion because then they stopped wanting you. He was like, the way to stay wanted is by never choosing a religion.
Playing hard to get.
Just curious, yeah.
Play hard to get.
Oh, what you got for me?
Avoidant attachment style.
There we go. Yeah.
And then for my dad, he, again, grew up like really conservative Lutheran, went to parochial school, and then in early college, which I think is when this kind of happens for people, it sounds like for you, Tyson, or for Curtis, Jessica, started questioning some of the ideas about hell and had an experience of just like real mental distress around the idea of heaven and hell and goodness and badness, and went and sought like spiritual counsel from a pastor who just lectured him about hippies. And so I think both of them were just like, okay, none of this actually feels like a fit. We're out. But it created an environment in my family where, first of all, we were sort of isolated spiritually and religiously from the rest of our family. So everyone else in our family was religious. And then there was us, which was a kind of like strange experience. And it was also not like my parents weren't religious. It was just that they were incredibly skeptical and sort of mistrusting of any institution, any like even just organized group of people, because I think that they had just felt like it was a big kind of abusive lie that they'd been raised in, and they felt really vigilant against getting sucked into something like that again. And so maybe a little bit to your point, Alex and Jess, there was a bit of a vacuum around spirituality and morality. There was like not a lot of instruction, but there was just a sense of this is not good. But atmospherically, tons of shame about sex and very low tolerance for queerness. So that was definitely the water I was still swimming in.
So let's talk about some of the whys. I think we've kind of like established that there is a pretty strong representation of people from, you know, religious backgrounds, and particularly like high control religious backgrounds in the poly community. And yeah, I don't think there are any, like, we haven't been able to find any like studies that kind of prove that, but
Yeah, I do think that the just prevalence of this as a phenomenon that people talk about like on Reddit forums or just inside the culture of polyamory, it's kind of understood to be a thing. I think even though that's somewhat anecdotal, it's worth
It
acknowledging
might be
that.
a particularly Seattle thing, especially too, but I'm not really sure. Like, I know this is sort of, what do you think, Tyson?
Well, I mean, the first question I have is you mentioned earlier that I think you looked up 60% of the population is evangelical or 30%. 30% of the evangelical. So I think part of it's just the makeup of people here in the U.S. Right? The people we're around, like a lot of people come from the religion, but in terms of like, and just to clarify, we're asking why this is a phenomenon.
A little bit establishing, is it a phenomenon? A little bit beginning to question or ask, why is it a phenomenon?
Sure.
So you can respond to either of those prompts.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think it definitely is. It's something that I come across all of the time. There are people who are ex-Christian to the point where I'm like, okay, I think it's actually probably more unique to not have, to be an atheist or like to not have a religious background. Like I'm always like, wait, what? Really? Mm-hmm. How did you escape this? And so I do think it's something I see all the time. And I have a lot of thoughts on why it is the way that it is. But yeah.
It maybe is worth also just identifying the term high control religion, because to your point, most people in this country come from some religious background. 20 to 30% of those people are going to be evangelicals.
Yeah, so 23% are evangelicals in the U.S., and then 30% of evangelical pastors identify themselves as Reformed. So it's,
okay,
that the 30% of that
that's
20%
more than I
is
thought.
8% or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah.
When we talk about like high control religions, what are we talking about? That's like a buzzword that gets tossed around in my profession a fair amount. I'm curious if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the word I would use is like fundamentalist religion. And I think what I see and what I grew up with is like there are people who take it to amount of seriousness that they drastically alter their lives and how they live right in the world, right, and how they view people. And so what that looks like for me is like I was homeschooled. My parents took me out of school because they didn't making drastic decisions. They didn't want me to be influenced by the world, and so they homeschooled me. I think it looks like going to a church out in the middle of in a cornfield somewhere, right, away from being pulled away from other people.
Isolation.
I think it looks a lot like a cult would look, the demands on people for performance and adhering to a specific kind of rules are really strict. Whereas I think a lot of evangelical Christians are like, they're more like, oh yeah, I grew up Christian, but like they don't necessarily live it every day, right?
I guess my skeptical, like sort of like sociological read of that makes me want to ask, like, is that in and of itself, like, was your family like pulled into that as a kind of like manipulation and like kind of control? Like obviously it's high control like inside of the family, but is it also like, like why do you think that these like institutions are recruiting people based on like their actual like sort of pure faith, or are they recruiting people based on like wanting to control them and the power that they get out of that? Like what is your kind of read on that?
I mean, I think the answer probably is yes to both in a way. Yeah. I don't think that most Christians are actually like trying to manipulate people to gain power. I really do think that most Christians honestly, and this is I think what makes it dangerous, is that people really, really do believe that hell is a place that people are going to go to. Okay. And they think that by trying to share this vision of life and by trying to get people to follow this, adhere to this Christian code, like they can escape that, right? And they fervently believe that, and I do think there's a genuine care for people.
Okay, because in my mind, it's like 95% of the people are as you describe, and then there's like always a guy at the top who's like, making a power play basically for sure, whatever reason. But I don't know.
I think it's also just worth saying, like when we're talking about the air we breathe and the water we swim in, this is the country that we're from. Mm-hmm. We are from a country where capitalism, patriarchy, and religion have worked together to control the population through fear. Oh, yeah. That's what we do. So, whether that's sense, hell,
there is always a guy,
or it's immigrants, or it's witches, or it's there's intentionality with like individual people. Sometimes I do think it's there, especially when you get to like the higher echelons of power and control inside organizations and systems.
Mm-hmm.
But, your everyday people are just like, yeah, I'm scared of a thing and I don't want to be scared of it. So tell me what to do so that I'm not scared of it. And I also want to keep my family members and friends safe from it, So I think it just sort of repeats that abusive, I would say, culture that we all come from in a way.
Yeah, for sure.
I wanted to just one more term and then like the dive into the whys. I think I've said religious trauma a couple of times, and I want to keep being able to coming back to that. What I mean when I say that and how I understand it and work with it in my work is this idea that you were raised inside abusive, controlling hierarchies. Like in the same way you might talk about like an abusive family where there's someone who has more power, often a patriarch or a parent who abuses that power in order to control you and manipulate you. These are religions that are doing that too. Yeah. And so it creates like a distance between a strong, authentic sense of self. It severs people from their own instincts. It causes people to like internalize this idea that there is something wrong and punishable or unlovable about them. It weaponizes shunning and outgrouping as a way to try and like keep people in line.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. My childhood.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that trauma is part of what is showing up in these communities. So with that in mind, I want to dive in, but you guys are going to kill me. I have to pee.
Tyson, why is it that there's so many ex-Christians, ex-evangelicals in poly?
I mean, I think I can speak from my experience as to why, like, what I see with the ex-Christians in my life and also my own experience. And I think that, like, most people are, I think we're influenced by our the world around us in youth, right? By our parents, by our friends. And when you're a Christian, you're influenced by your religion, right? And what you're taught every Sunday. And so, at least for me, I built up this entire worldview of what, the world was created in 6 days, right? Noah's Ark is a real thing, and like evolution isn't true. And so like there's all of these, my entire world, my understanding of the world, of reality, was based upon this religious text, right? Based upon Christianity. And the process of questioning that, and I think what people don't realize is like we're kind of questioning our entire reality. And when you question your entire reality, you're really deconstructing what you think you know about the world. And I think what it did for me at least, is like it created this sense of like every single belief I have now after Christianity is something that I own, is something that's mine, something that I earned because I literally didn't believe this and I made the decision to believe this. And so I owned it. And so there's a level of like, I'm here now and I did all this work to get here. And so I'm going to live the way that I want to live, right? And I'm not as concerned about stigma or what people are going to think because I just lost my entire community, right? So I don't really need that, and so I'm going to explore all the things that I want to explore. So I think there's that, and I think the other piece to this is like when you question everything, right, and you go to it, especially when it comes to like monogamy, it's like, well, what else is out there? Because there was this very big sense for me leaving Christianity of like, oh my gosh, like if I don't believe this anymore, like the possibilities of the world of my life, they're endless. It's like this weird feeling of being like there's all these paths I could take. A little overwhelming, but it's like, what do I want to actually explore? And so because my history was and because sexual repression is such a big piece, I think for a lot of Christians, when they leave, endless possibility in terms of sexuality, and then they ask questions about it more, and then we find non-monogamy, we find polyamory, we find things like swinging, and it's like there's all these ways to do this, and I want to explore all of that, right? And so I think that's why you see a lot of it, is because we've been through a lot, and we want to make sure we want to like explore, and Yeah, when you question everything now becomes something you can think about.
Yeah. And that might be a stronger impulse than it is when it's just sort of like you're passively like monogamous, and it's not something that was like super deeply emphasized as like a core value and a really important thing, and purity culture and stuff like that.
Yes.
Then it's like a little bit easier to passively go along with that. But you're saying when it's really rammed down your throat, then once you're like free of that, you're like, oh, okay, this is another one of those things that I'm really gonna question.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of people go through life that I've seen not really questioning what they believe, even if like I agree with them on everything. Like sometimes I get the sense that like, oh, they were just taught this growing up and that's why they believe it, and like it's kind of part of their value system, but they never really questioned it. But it's like, no, I've questioned everything and I've chosen to believe what I believe, and I think that creates a sense of like purpose with it, and a desire. It shows a desire to learn more and be curious. So that's what I would say. Yeah. I'm curious to know what you guys think about this.
Well, two of the pieces of what you said that were really interesting to me. One is this deep commitment to autonomy because you've had the experience of being denied it.
Yes.
And that idea that everything I believe I earned, and I feel really like integrated into it. It feels integrated into me.
Yeah.
That really stood out to me. And then also, the worst thing has happened. You have lost your family. You've lost your community. And when we think about, I was talking about religious trauma, one of the most effective ways of controlling people is essentially by saying, you're going to lose your family, you're going to lose your community, you're going to be shunned, you're going to be alone.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it's as though the worst thing has happened and you've survived the worst thing.
Yeah.
And that, while there is like trauma in that, implicit in that, there is also a kind of hard-earned strength.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I love being around ex-Christians because of that. Like I really do appreciate them quite a bit.
Because they have done that work.
Yeah, they've done the work. They've thought through everything that they believe in, and they know why they can stand by it, right? And I love that.
Mm-hmm. Is the flip side of that like some sense of kind of like zealotry in the other direction, or like being extremely enthusiastic about this thing over here because it's the opposite of the thing that I was raised with that I'm rebelling against?
Yeah, I think it's a sense that like, at least in the communities I run in, it's like people go along with it because like that's the thing to do and that's the thing to say, right? And they don't. I see kind of the opposite of like, well, this is what my parents taught me. This is what I learned in college. This is what all the progressive voices are saying, and so they just kind of go along with things and don't really ever question it, and that bothers me too, right? Just because it's not that it's a bad thing, I guess. It's just that like, I don't know, the world is really complicated, really, really complicated, and right and wrong is not nearly as clear as we think it is, and we really should think a lot more about that. And I think that when the process of thinking about that, I think it makes right and wrong more real and integrated into who you are.
I mean, I would go so far as to say, we touched on this earlier before the podcast. I think the true challenge is being able to tolerate how complex morality is and a world in which most things are not going to fall into right and wrong. Yeah. And being able to cope with that, discern, stay in relationship to yourself and others through that discomfort. I mean, that is the maybe it's not a false promise. That is the promise of religion or any kind of zealotry, is that you will be released from that moral complexity and from the discomfort of not knowing sometimes what is right and what is wrong, or how to tell, or where you fall on which side of that line. And so to me, like the true rebel
was a man named Jesus Christ.
Is someone who's trying to build a window of tolerance for things being complex.
Yeah.
And those tend to be the people I trust the most.
Yeah. Which I was joking, but that is probably what Jesus was doing kind of in his time, like hanging out with a bunch of prostitutes and stuff and being like, accept these people.
For sure.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking about when I was brainstorming some of the whys, which I want to hear if these resonate for you, is that idea of belonging, community, and chosen family. That polyamory and non-monogamy, if you have lost your community and your family, provides a new type of structure for building relationship and community and family. And I think we have to like shade in queerness here too. A lot of the folks who I work with who are coming from high control religious backgrounds into polyamory and non-monogamy are queer. And part of what they're unpacking, part of the abuse they experienced was not being able to express that to themselves, even let alone the world. So that chosen family piece seems like kind of an important crossover between religious communities and polyamory.
For sure. Yes, I think, there's so much emphasis on like being part of a community in the church, being like, I mean, the whole idea is that like, it's kind of funny because the picture that I was raised of like what the church is, right? The church is the bride of Christ, right? And so like we're all the bride of Christ. So it's kind of like a really weird polyamory thing where we're all
also queer,
like, very queer, right? We're all like partnered with Jesus. And so anyway, so like there's this idea that like we're a part of something bigger, and like these are people that you're going to be with now and also in heaven. And so like a lot of a measure, but then there's all rules around how that should look, right? Like you cannot have anything more than like sex and romance is for your spouse in marriage. And so there's a lot of closeness. And so I think leaving the church, we still crave that, right? And I think that's actually something that the church can, I think why it's so successful is because of the people, right? Is because of the community. And so I definitely agree that for me, it's like I grew up with a lot of really close friendships, people that I love dearly, and moving into like a dynamic where I can only do that with one person just doesn't quite fit.
So it was almost like running counter to itself.
Yeah. I would say that is the case. And I think that's true of I think a lot of people, whether they're ex-Christian or not, go to polyamory because they're seeking community in a world that's very lonely
and isolated
and becoming more so. It's
yeah. It kind of makes me wonder if that is also the influence of there being a lot of ex-Christians, in those communities, and then they bring more of that sense of community and desire for it, and like the know-how to like build it too. I mean, that's the thing that I think I've seen, like, like with you were like a very strong like community organizer and like bring people together in this like beautiful way that I think probably is maybe some stuff that you learned in your upbringing.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I wanted to be a pastor growing up, right? Yeah. Like that's what I wanted to be. And so I see it in a lot of people who are ex-Christians. Like we have a talent for bringing people together, and we know how to make it fun. And I think that like that's where the power of people who are ex-religious can really, that's something they can bring to the table, is really bringing people together, creating community, and like we're not afraid to do that, where I think a lot of people are afraid to make connections. Yeah.
To that point, when we started this like Radical Caregivers political meetup once a month, I actually polled friends of mine who are religious about how do you start something that actually can continue and grow. And the advice that they had for me was same place, same time, reliability, childcare, food.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, it would seem obvious, but I think to your point, like if you didn't grow up in that just being like a culture and a skill, you don't necessarily know it.
Yeah, absolutely. Food's the most important part, I'd say.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about does this exist and where are we coming from, and a little bit around the why. Why is this a phenomenon? Are there whys that we haven't gotten to yet that we want to before we start talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I found a Reddit thread that was talking about this, and like, I think it's a lot of the stuff that we'd covered, but other people also named just like, more explicitly like the reaction to sexual repression and just being like, feeling sexually liberated and having that freedom. And they also pointed out like just like being familiar with being in a counterculture. It's kind of interesting, right? Like if you're, from a like sort of extreme evangelical background or other religious background, or like grew up in a cult or whatever, you're used to being different. And so, being different through polyamory is like kind of refreshing. And I think that maybe is a segue into some of the like the challenging parts too, right? Like what are the things that show up in a really intense like in-group?
Yeah, because a lot of what we explore on the show is, whatever your background is, you don't just like show up in polyamory and you're like, now I'm liberated. I'm liberated from sexual shame or, my upbringing or the trauma that I've experienced. You show up here as a way of unpacking it. So I'm curious, like, how does that kind of religious trauma and some of the things that people are escaping, how does that show up in polyamorous communities in ways that can be challenging?
That's a great question. I think from my personal experience, like, I think, when you're in a high control religion and you have high control parents and authoritarian parents, like, it can be really, really difficult as an adult to make your own decisions, right? To know what you want and who you want to be and to stand by those, because you're usually just being told your entire life, like, who you are to be and how you ought to live. And so it can be difficult sometimes, even something as simple as like trying to figure out, like, especially if there's another person that I'm with, it's like, well, I should want to do what they want to do. This, like, and like having a hard time, like, making a decision on what I want. And this could be simple as like finding a place to go for dinner, right? It's like,
well, but you're the man, so you should just
right. I know, right? I should just be able to decide. But like, so those things, I think, also knowing where I want to go and just in my life in general, sometimes it can be difficult to suss that out and to figure out, like, who I am and where I want to go. I've done a lot of work, but it's really through just being in community and seeing myself reflected in other people, I think, and seeing the difference and just learning where other people start or stop and where I stop, if that makes sense, in terms of like the enmeshment piece. So I think that's one area. What I would say is like, just that having that sense of self and sense of self-trust can be difficult to come by.
Because if you've been raised to prioritize the group and like a sort of hegemonic group and way of thinking, it's like a practice you have to be aware of to do something different and to identify, like, I am an individual person and I could be in touch with my needs and communicate them. And that doesn't have to be a threat to my relationships. Which it's interesting how much we talk about that on this show outside of a religious context.
Yeah.
That's just a hard relationship skill in a culture that doesn't encourage it. We're such a weird culture where we're all about the individual, but not actually comfortable with people being authentically connected to their needs. How did we pull that off? That was like a weird needle to thread.
Yeah, I have no idea how to pull that off. That is interesting.
It's the worst of both worlds. Really isolated and also incredibly codependent.
Yeah. Well, and I think maybe you're pointing also towards just like how, or if some of those like hierarchies can show up again in poly communities, because of some of that, like, I mean, I think about, like, especially I feel like with people who are kind of like new to non-monogamy or polyamory, like there is like a little, some like dogma there, and we like have our, what is the good way to be poly, and like here are kind of like the rules, and we have our like sacred texts of the ethical slut and polysecure, and like read those books and then like kind of know how to be. It does, I mean, it's certainly not to the extreme, but it does feel like sometimes that stuff shows up. And then when there are communities, like close-knit communities of poly people, there's also like a certain amount of like people make a mistake or do something wrong and they're maybe shunned. I don't know if that's more than it is in like any social group of people, but it's certainly the thing that I've seen happen, Yeah.
I mean, I think the communities I've been a part of, I've been very quick to shun people. And that's something that always bothers me, even if it's the right decision.
Talk a little bit more about that, the shunning piece, because I would say my observation of how religious trauma shows up in my office is this shunning piece. The inclination to do it, the fear of it happening to you, the kind of like sense that it's always lurking in the shadows as a possibility and you got to get on the right side of it.
I think like what I see in the communities that I'm a part of is like there's this idea that if someone's hurting other people or doing something that's like causing some pain or discomfort, that the right thing to do is just to kick them out, is to like force them out of the community, push them away. And I think that sometimes that's necessary, but I think more than anything, like we need to have more of a like restorative approach where we're actually trying to like work with the people that are causing hurt and like bringing them, and that's something that's very, very counter-Christian of like, you know, if there's someone who's the there's a text within the Bible, I can't remember the verse, but basically where it's like, shun the evil one from among you, right? So like very much about like kicking people out who are going to cause damage and cause pain and excommunication. And I think I see that a lot in progressive communities, and I don't think it's always the right course of action. Yeah, I'm not sure how that's...
Yeah, and you're just making me think about how also like in a monogamous marriage, you know, like the shunning is you get divorced, right? But this is more present in like polyamory because there's all of the interlocking relationships, and like I can like observe that like, you know, my meta is treating my partner in some way, or like, you know, we're all like intertwined together in a polycule or something like that. So it's much more like possible that somebody would be identified as a problem person who is breaking the norms of that in group, whether it's like a bigger group or a really small group, but it's still like a group of more than 2 people. And so they're potentially going to be like punitive, repercussions for behavior.
Absolutely. And I think another layer that you see, so something that's we see in the church is like very much like a policing of behavior, right? You need to act a certain way, you need to talk a certain way, you need to live a certain way. And in a lot of this polyamorous spaces I've been in, you see that too, of like, you need to say things this way, you need to use these labels, you know, and it's very big on policing behavior. And I think that sometimes that's maybe a remnant of our religious past, right? Of kind of that policing.
I'd be curious to hear examples of that. What are some examples of the policing that you observe in polyamory?
I think it's... I guess, I come from things from a perspective of things being a little bit more gray, and that we're all in different places at different times, and we're all on our own journeys trying to understand how the world works and what's right and what's wrong. And from that perspective, in polyamory and probably more broadly progressive communities, there's this expectation that you're supposed to use a certain language all the time, that you're supposed to... I'm going to use an example of like... wearing masks, right? There's certain people have expectations around like you should always have masks at every kind of event that you host as like a polyamorous person. And then I think that like that expectation gets like pushed on everyone, and I don't think that's always the right way to go. And so I think that like that's an example of an idea of like trying to force our opinion on other people, even maybe when we're not comfortable. And I don't think that's always the right way, if that makes sense.
I think so. This comes back to, can we tolerate difference?
Yes.
And I think this is where I also will see like religious backgrounds or high control religious backgrounds influence polyamorous culture. We are engaging in something that is different, countercultural, to your point, Alex. But inside this counterculture, can we tolerate difference? What does that look like and feel like? Masks would be an example of that. There was, I was just thinking about something like unicorn hunting.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's such a good example of a thing that has been like, this is on the outs. This is not a cool thing to do. We don't do this. Cool people who practice this the right way don't do it. Or the idea of like non-hierarchical poly.
Yeah.
There's a lot of judgment around people who are practicing something other than non-hierarchical poly, whatever that means. And again, it's just like, there's the right way, the evolved way of doing this, and then there's the wrong way, the tacky way of doing
But those things are often, those judgments are often cover for probably people just like, you know, it's not for me, or it makes me feel uncomfortable, and so
I've had a bad experience with it.
Or I've had a bad experience with it, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we have a lot, like you mentioned, polysecure. There are a lot of polyamorous, like educators in media that touts a certain way of doing things, and I think sometimes it's like easy to be like, oh, this is the way. Yeah. But like we don't know. There's no one way, right?
And if you have a really ungrounded group of people that are kind of like, you know, coalesced about an identity, but it's not an identity with a lot of like legacy or history or like any of that.
Cultural reinforcement or support.
Reinforcement more broadly, then people step up as leaders, and they're almost like invited or expected to tell you how to be. And then, you know, in telling you how to be, they might, be overly prescriptive. I do also want to bring sex back into this, though, because I love talking about sex now. Because I think that creates it's also just like a sensitive space, right? So
Heightened
people are like
emotionality.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's going to be a lot of like feelings and vulnerability around sex, and like ironically, you know, that is probably the root reason. Like it can be chaotic. It can like create a lot of turmoil for people. Like you're saying, there's heightened emotionality. So we want to like control that and have like rules about safety and, you know, all of rules about consent and all of these things. But like we don't want to leave these things up to individuals because they're scary, right? And that's probably the original reason that all of the biblical like religious control started in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Tolerating difference in really sensitive situations with heightened emotionality and high stakes is like, that's the highest level of trying to figure out how to do that. And polyamorous people, you know, this also shows up in activist spaces. This shows up in places where it's like, okay, it's not like we're tolerating difference in a low stakes, high trust
Like
environment
an axe
necessarily.
throwing community or something.
Right. Which actually would be
They're
maybe
mostly polyamorous, yeah.
a lot of crossover there. But that's tough. And there aren't right or wrong answers. And one of the reasons why shame is effective in controlling people's sexual behavior is because we are scared of difference, our own and other people's, of trying to or having to navigate that. And it sometimes can feel easier to just be like, what are the rules? Even if I have to suppress some part of myself or not express some part of myself or tolerate something that feels uncomfortable, it's better to just know what the rules are than to be in touch with that authentically and try and communicate about it and have tolerance for all that complexity at once when everybody's clothes are off or are in romantic relationship with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. I think something I would just want to bring up that like I think a lot of that I'm constantly telling my like past Christian people in my life is that like we're not like anything goes people anymore, right? I think the important thing about like in terms of like healing sexual shame for me has been developing a new ethic around it, right? Realizing that my ethic from Christianity was really poor and then developing a new ethic around it. And like I do think there's like it's not anything goes. It's not everything goes. We still have rules that we need to follow, but the difference is it's not based upon this ancient religion. It's based upon people coming together and deciding like, okay, what is the best way for us to navigate sex in a way that's healthy for everyone? And how do we do that? And then we develop some rules, we develop some guidelines, and we try to follow those as a community. So it's not like throwing all that stuff out. And I think this is, again, where like for me, knowing what's wrong, knowing what I don't want to do helps me to celebrate what is good about sex and things like that, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That it's not anything goes, that there are still rules, but that they're not rigid and they are formed in collaboration.
Yeah, it's all, I mean, and the rules I'm referring to is like just consent, right? Things around consent and things around autonomy and things around like respecting other people and elements like that of like, they're not like hard, fast, like specific rules, but just like this, you know, consent focused ethic.
Okay. So, you know how you said you liked our podcast because it's focused on mistakes? This is the portion of the podcast when I wanted to ask you, what are some mistakes that you feel like, or a mistake you feel like you've made in this realm where your religious trauma showed up in a way that surprised you, or you were navigating someone else's in a way where you learned a hard lesson?
Can I let you guys go first? I
Yes.
can think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, it's cruel to ask somebody a superlative question like that on the spot without having to prepare. I can't think of anything, but I guess I'm saying I don't have very much.
I just have to find one to choose. Like, which mistake do I choose?
Yeah, not the worst one, the second worst one.
So one that comes up for me, and it's something that I think is relevant when we're talking about any kind of trauma, maybe specifically religious trauma, especially folks who are coming out later in life or exploring sexual identity later in life. We are often engaging in life stages sort of out of order. So we might be 45 years old in body, and like professionally, I might seem that age. In other areas of my life, I might, but maybe in sex and romance and love, I'm kind of more like 25, right? or certain experiences. I'm younger because I didn't have that kind of like supported, healthy development through the life stages in order. I didn't develop my sense of sexual identity and have those experiences in my 20s. I'm having them now. So I think a mistake that I kind of consistently make is not recognizing that in myself sometimes. And so I'll have relationships or sexual encounters where I kind of like show up in a way that's immature or in a way that surprises me, and then don't know how to take accountability for it and feel kind of like ashamed. Maybe I have like a sexual experience I don't like, that, to be specific. And 45-year-old me, professional Sarah, like integrated, mature Sarah, knows how to talk about having an experience I don't like in a way that is like sensitive for the other person and also, caring of myself. But instead of doing that, I don't say anything, and I just kind of like slowly disengage from that physical relationship. I think that's a mistake that I've made. And I think sometimes when I'm engaging with folks who have this kind of trauma, I'm not always sensitive to that with them as well. It's maybe a little complicated, but that's what comes up for me.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I have one now.
All right.
It's not one. It's like, it's more of a broader, like, I think a thing that happens with me is that, like, I was taught and raised that, like, that I'm an evil person deep down, right? That my heart is dead is the word we would use, like, and basically capable of nothing good whatsoever, right? Without Jesus, right? And so I struggle to this day with a sense of self-worth, of like being like, of seeing myself as a worthy person. And so what happens is when I get into relationships, and something that I notice is that, like, I have this performative nature of wanting to prove myself, wanting to earn someone's affection, thinking that I don't have it, right? And thinking that I'm not good enough for this person. And so it brings out a lot of anxiety. It brings a lot of like fawning kind of behavior where I'm like trying to keep someone close. And it can be really harmful to relationships because there are dynamics where if there's someone who is maybe more distant, someone who's maybe more like less caring, I feel this desire to like prove it and to chase, because like that feels real, right? Because that's what Christianity was. It's like constantly trying, like never being worthy, but constantly trying to act in a way, live in a way, pray in a way to be deserving of the love that was given to me by Jesus, right? And so I chase those kinds of relationships. But then there are people in my life who actually do care and do show love without conditions. And then I kind of push those away because it's like, well, that can't be real. That can't be true, right? And so this is a really core way where my religious trauma has impacted my sense of joy and happiness in relationships, and is like been something that I've had to navigate quite a bit. So I have other mistakes I'm sure that I've made. This is kind of, I know that I've made tons of mistakes. This is the one I think I can kind of see really clearly across my polyamorous life and how it's kind of impacted relationships. And I do believe it's very much based upon this religious shame. Because the funny thing is that it wasn't that long ago. It was 2020 when I became an atheist. Like I haven't been in this this way very long, and I still have a lot of growth and healing to do.
I really appreciate that, and naming how a compromised and eroded sense of self-worth is a kind of crucial element of religious trauma.
Yeah, definitely.
And of course, that's going to show up in our relationships. Yeah. What about you, Alex? Anything?
Well, I mean, again, like coming from the place where I don't, that the religious trauma that they have, if I have any, is like ambient. I'm not sure that there are things that I can connect to it directly, but certainly like from an empathetic perspective, like the things that are hard that seem like they would be even that much harder if you were coming from that background, like, that sense of shame, but like shame about being like trying to paper over things that are hard. Like sometimes I feel like, coming from what is perhaps like a comparatively like privileged background of not being told like that your heart is dead, or that you needed to really strive to be good and to be whole, it still is very hard to like feel that way, and to feel like I feel like I should have figured out all of this stuff, and I shouldn't experience like jealousy, and I shouldn't experience shame, because of not having those things like prescribed as explicitly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just kind of impatient with yourself because your challenges around connected self-worth are not, you can't point to some specific reason why, and so it feels
there's just
more
like
vulnerable.
a vague group of hippie boomers who kind of like, formed my my community, and like the sort of community of morality around my life.
I know we're right up against our 11:45 deadline. I have 1 minute. And I'm curious, Alex, for you, since we've recognized that you've dated a lot of people from this background, is there anything that is coming to mind for you about mistakes you maybe have made or misunderstandings you might have had about those partners, or ways that you might proceed that are more trauma-informed?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's, certainly like, I am certainly like drawn to such people for some reason, and in relationships, but also like in friendships too. And I think it is like that difference, and sort of being attracted to some of the positive things that like you get in those kinds of communities. But it's like a hard gap of understanding, and like, I think I could probably, do better in kind of accepting those struggles that those folks have.
And the recognition that they're not over. I think that's something that I really heard you saying, Tyson, is that leaving a church, leaving that kind of background and showing up in a more liberated place doesn't mean that the trauma is not still present, and that it's not something in the past, but it's something that people are still navigating.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I don't really know about how to be trauma informed in relationships, like individual relationships. I can see how you would try to do it in your practice, or try to do it like in a community, or like at a event or something like that. But like in a kind of like two-way relationship, it's
challenging
because everybody's showing up with trauma.
Yeah, I would say that is the number one piece of advice, professional advice I would have, is naming it. Just how can we recognize that this exists, this type of trauma exists, and it's going to show up for people in different ways, and we're going to name it and have a language around it so that when it does, we can call it that. And that like just helps us be able to talk about it. That's my first step of like, how would you have a trauma-informed community?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think like, to answer kind of your question, like as an ex-Christian myself, if someone's dating me, what I would tell them is like naming like, yeah, I still have shit that I have to work through. I have stuff I have to deal with. And I like know that like I may not always be sure about things. I may not always have a good, like I may not always be able to be super indecisive and make good decisions. I may not always be sure of things. I'm gonna be and there's a lot more going on. And I think understanding, like especially how many polyamorous people are ex-religious, like just being understanding and have, I hate this word, but I'm going to say it anyway, have grace for the ex-Christians in your life, because like there's a lot of things, our entire reality, that we're still unpacking and still working through.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyson.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for listening to Mistakes Were Made. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. I think this next one's going to be with the author of an exciting new book about kinship that maybe actually dovetails out of this conversation really well. Thinking about community around polyamory and outside of it. So until then, subscribe and follow us, like us, listen to us, tell your friends about it, and find us at Mistakes Cast on Instagram.
Bye.
Bye.